You know, when you break your arm, right? Like you get an X-ray and it gives you this completely clean binary answer.
Oh, yeah. Broken or not broken.
Exactly. You look at the film, you see the jagged white line, the doctor points to it, and you just know. And I think we really crave that same clean visual certainty when we look at history.
We really do.
Yeah.
Especially with, political
Right.
revolutions.
We want the cinematic climax. We want the massive crowd filling the central square or the statue of the dictator being pulled down.
Or the tyrant's helicopter fleeing in the dead of night.
Yes. We want that absolute clarity of a single historical event where a society just definitively snaps from oppressed to free.
Which, it creates a super compelling narrative. History books tend to kind of compress decades of this agonizing, invisible struggle into like a single iconic photograph of a protest.
Which is wild because it leaves us with the impression that revolution is just this spontaneous combustion of public anger. But today, we're going to look at the hidden, incredibly messy plumbing of how a 21st century revolution is actually engineered.
Yeah, because when you strip away the romance of the crowd, the underlying tissue of political organizing is deeply, deeply complex.
It's multi-layered,
Yeah.
it is fraught with all these paradoxes, and it relies on systems that most people never even see. So that is the journey we're taking you on today.
Right.
We are deconstructing this fascinating, intensely specific blueprint for modern regime change.
And we're looking at a roadmap that honestly completely ignores the dramatic street protests, at least initially.
Totally.
It instead forces us to examine these invisible networks of human trust, the rigid constitutional mechanics, and the digital architecture that actually makes a transition of power viable.
It's a lot to unpack. So our primary source for this deep dive is a sprawling, really detailed blog post. It's dated Thursday, June 11th, 2026.
Yeah.
And the title alone really sets a certain tone. It's called Barackface, The Imperative of Political Organizing for the Iranian Diaspora.
It's quite a title.
It really is. The author is Paramendra Kumar Bhagat. And, to understand a single word of his blueprint, we really have to understand the mind that built it.
Because his background is genuinely wild.
Insanely wild. Right at the top of the piece, he establishes his credentials by stating that he was Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City.
Which is an essential piece of context for everything that follows here. We have to consider what the Obama campaign actually represented back in 2008.
Right, it wasn't just a political movement.
Exactly. It was a fundamental shift in how human beings were mobilized. They basically married the oldest form of politics, knocking on a neighbor's door with what were, at the time, completely unprecedented digital data operations.
Like tracking interactions and scoring voters.
Yes, and relying on these hyper-local precinct captains. So that specific DNA, that unshakable belief in structured, metric-driven grassroots mobilization, it informs literally every single paragraph of Bhagat's thesis regarding Iran.
I see the connection there, but it gets even more eccentric when you look at the sidebar of this source.
Oh, the sidebar is fascinating.
It's not just a political organizer's diary. It is a monument to a very particular, almost obsessive kind of mind. The author lists over 5.2 million page views. There are decades of archives.
And the books. We have to talk about the books.
Yes. He lists dozens of titles he's authored. He's got these futuristic tech concepts like Lumina AI, the $1 trillion sun, and physical AWS, how the logistics cloud will reshape global commerce.
And then he delves into these massive socioeconomic theories. He's got books like Kalkiism, the economic and spiritual blueprint for an age of abundance. He writes about Earth-to-Earth rocketry, agentic AI, quantum computing.
And it's all right next to books on, like, sales playbooks and frugal living.
It really paints a picture of a guy who looks at everything. The cosmos, artificial intelligence, human society, a dictatorship.
Yeah.
He sees it all as a series of interconnected systems.
Systems that can be hacked.
Hacked, optimized, engineered, and scaled.
Which brings us to our mission today. We're going to deconstruct how that specific engineering mindset applies to the Iranian diaspora.
We're going to explore how Bhagat envisions this massive, fractured community utilizing a really calculated mix of old-school living room organizing and cutting-edge democracy tech.
All to dismantle a theocratic regime. But before we get into the actual mechanics of drinking tea in living rooms and coordinating with military drones, because yes, we are absolutely going there, we need to establish a very clear boundary for you, the listener.
Very important point to make here.
We are unpacking highly charged geopolitical concepts today. This involves active regime change, a systemic oppression, international foreign policy.
A lot of heavy stuff.
Right. So our role is strictly to act as impartial analysts. We are examining the author's logic, his strategies, and his worldview without taking any sides or endorsing any proposed actions.
We're just looking at the blueprints of the building.
Exactly, regardless of whether it should ever actually be built.
So, to understand that blueprint, we really have to start with Fagat's fundamental critique of how people currently attempt to resist tyranny. He introduces this paradigm shift that strips all the romance away from traditional activism.
He is incredibly blunt about this too. He states that showing up for a political protest or a march, well, he calls it great, is absolutely not political organizing.
He completely severs those two concepts.
Yeah.
For Fagat, organizing has this rigid, almost mathematical definition. It literally means launching or joining a peaceful organization. That's it.
So if you aren't doing that...
If you aren't engaging in the bureaucratic, structural act of building an organization, you are not organizing. You are merely expressing dissent.
Okay, let me try to put an analogy to this, because when I first read it, it felt a bit elitist.
It can definitely come across that way.
It reads like he's saying that protesting is akin to, I don't know, screaming from the bleachers at a football game.
Yeah.
Like you're wearing the team colors, you're passionate, you're making a ton of noise.
Yeah.
But organizing is the act of actually owning the team, drafting the players, building the stadium, and scheduling the season.
That captures his distinction perfectly, yeah.
But I have to challenge this logic for a second. Isn't a massive march the ultimate display of numbers? I mean, when 1 million people take over a street, defying a regime's police force, isn't that the very definition of political power?
It's the visual definition we're used to, sure.
Right, so why does a guy who is so obsessed with metrics dismiss the visual power of millions of bodies in the street so early in his thesis? It just seems to contradict how every major historical revolution is taught to us.
It absolutely challenges our historical memory. But if we filter his argument through his background in those data-driven campaigns we talked about, the logic starts to emerge.
Yep.
He views street protests as raw kinetic energy. 1 million people in the street generates massive heat and light. But without a structural container, that energy eventually dissipates. I mean, people have to go back to work. People get tired. People get arrested. The energy just burns out because there is no mechanism to store it.
It's like lightning without a battery.
Exactly. And Fagat argues that peaceful organizing, which is the incredibly tedious, unglamorous work of drafting bylaws, electing local committee members, managing rosters, that is the battery.
Huh.
That structure is the prerequisite for actual power, because his ultimate goal isn't just shouting at a dictator until he flees.
The goal is governing the day after he flees.
Yes.
Yeah.
He points out that the real objective is to contest and win free and fair elections, and to take proposed laws through a parliamentary process.
Right, which you can't do in the street.
No, he notes that this is the only way laws are actually made in a democracy. You cannot submit a bill to a parliament using a protest march. You need the machinery of a political party to transition from resisting the old laws to actually writing new ones.
So he's basically saying if you don't build the bureaucracy of governance right now, while you're in the diaspora, you won't have the machinery ready when the state collapses. You will just have this massive power vacuum.
And history shows us power vacuums invite new autocrats to step in, usually under the guise of restoring order.
Wow, yeah.
So by insisting on formal organizations, he is trying to pre-install the operating system of a democracy before the movement even sets foot in the capital.
I actually love that idea, pre-installing the operating system. But that brings up a massive, glaring problem. If the very first step is building these formal organizations, how do you unite a diaspora that has vastly different, frequently completely contradictory visions for the country's future?
Well, this requires a leap into what we could call radical structural inclusion. Fagat insists that all these disparate, newly formed organizations must gather under a single umbrella organization.
And the diversity he imagines under this umbrella is where I find myself deeply skeptical.
It's enhanced.
It really is. He outlines the factions he envisions sitting together. He says there can be a group that wants a secular republic. He can imagine a group that wants a constitutional monarchy. And then he explicitly states he can imagine a group that advocates for Sharia law in Iran.
Yeah.
And they all need to be under the same umbrella.
It is a staggering proposition for coalition building, honestly.
It's just to pause on this. He expects people advocating for strict theocratic Sharia law and people advocating for a secular progressive republic to peacefully organize under the same umbrella.
That is his argument.
How does that not instantly collapse into a fiery inferno of ideological infighting? I mean, these are not minor disagreements over tax brackets or zoning laws. These are mutually exclusive, foundational views of reality, gender, and human rights.
It's the fatal flaw that shatters most opposition movements, you're right. But Foggatt has engineered a specific patch for this ideological paradox. He calls it the Common Minimum Program.
The Common Minimum Program. Okay, it sounds very bureaucratic. What does it actually entail?
It is basically the minimum viable agreement required for the coalition to function. He argues that to sit under this umbrella, these opposing groups do not need to agree on what the final laws of the country will be.
Okay.
They only need to agree on two foundational principles: human rights and democracy.
Let me test that logic for a second. A group advocating for Sharia law and a group advocating for a secular republic are going to have fundamentally incompatible definitions of the phrase human rights.
Right.
Oh, without a doubt.
So how does a common minimum program survive that translation error?
It survives through a rigid sequential roadmap. Foggatt is telling these groups, do not fight about the final destination until you have jointly paved the road. He lays out a strict timeline. First, the regime collapses. Second, an interim democratic government is formed. Third, elections are held for a constituent assembly.
So it's essentially a truce of mechanics.
Exactly. He literally writes, the time to contest will be later when you already have democracy, but right now you have to gather under one umbrella organization.
He's identifying the bottleneck. Yes, he's telling the monarchist, the secularist, and the Islamist, look, none of you can implement your specific vision while the current regime holds power. Your only logical move is to cooperate on removing the bottleneck, establish a free electoral system, and then you can fight each other at the ballot box.
We agree to build the boxing ring together so that later we can step inside and fight fairly.
That's a great way to put it.
It is incredibly pragmatic, treating these deeply held political ideologies as secondary variables to the primary variable of structural democracy. But, an umbrella organization requires leadership. An interim government requires an executive.
Which introduces a complex mathematical problem regarding the current figures in the Iranian diaspora.
Yeah, he takes a remarkably analytical approach here, specifically looking at Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of the former Shah of Iran. Foggatt does not mince words. He refers to Pahlavi as a ball of confusion.
He's critiquing Pahlavi's stated public posture here because for years, Pahlavi has often tried to remain sort of above the political fray.
Yeah.
He frequently states that it is up to the Iranian people to decide whether they want a constitutional monarchy or a republic once the current regime falls. He positions himself as a unifying neutral figure rather than like a dictator in waiting.
Which, to an outside observer, sounds incredibly democratic, like I'll let the people decide. But Foggatt looks at that stance and sees a glaring logic puzzle.
He really unpacks the constitutional trap inherent in Pahlavi's neutrality, because if Pahlavi's goal is to let the people choose between a monarchy and a republic, and the system requires an interim democratic government to facilitate that choice, what role does Pahlavi actually play during the interim?
Right, let's follow Foggatt's logic tree here. If Pahlavi serves as the interim prime minister or the interim president after the regime collapses, he mathematically disqualifies himself from ever being the future constitutional monarch.
Exactly. Because the role of a constitutional monarch in a parliamentary system is to be a nonpartisan, unifying head of state. It is entirely separate from the gritty, partisan reality of being a prime minister, who is the head of government.
Making day-to-day decisions.
Right. If Pahlavi takes the job of interim prime minister, he becomes a political actor making partisan decisions. He cannot subsequently ascend to the throne as a neutral arbiter after the elections. The well is poisoned.
Therefore, Foggatt argues, Pahlavi must be slotted into the role of interim constitutional monarch immediately upon regime collapse.
Yes.
During the interim democratic government, that is the only way to logically keep the option of a permanent constitutional monarchy open for the people to vote on later.
It's an incredibly rigid parsing of constitutional roles. He basically sorts human leaders like variables in an equation. If variable A Pahlavi equals future monarch, then variable A cannot equal interim prime minister.
I find his engineering mindset fascinating. It's like a resistor on a circuit board cannot suddenly act as a capacitor.
Yep.
Everything has a precise, unchangeable function. But if Pahlavi is parked in the ceremonial role of interim constitutional monarch, it creates a massive vacuum because the interim prime minister is the one who actually holds the executive power to transition the country. So who fills that role?
Well, Pagat falls back on his core belief in organizing. He suggests holding online elections within the diaspora to let a leader emerge organically.
He does float one specific name, almost as a hypothetical. He mentions Masih Alinejad, the prominent Iranian American journalist and activist who is, famous for her fierce opposition to the regime's compulsory hijab laws.
He mentions her, yeah, but he instantly issues a caveat. He insists, that is not for me to decide. That is for an organized Iranian diaspora to decide.
He trusts the mechanism of the vote way more than he trusts his own opinion on who should lead.
The system produces the leader. The leader does not produce the system.
Okay, so we've built this massive theoretical framework. We have umbrella organizations, common minimum programs, interim constitutional monarchs, online elections.
It's a lot of high-level stuff.
Yeah, but high-level geopolitical theories are absolutely useless without breathing human beings to execute them. How does a fractured, terrified diaspora actually build this massive umbrella in reality?
This is where the strategy zooms all the way into a micro level. It becomes surprisingly intimate.
He argues that the way you build this massive organization is through massive membership drives, driven primarily by house parties.
It is a really jarring contrast to the grand geopolitical maneuvering we just discussed.
It really is. I mean, when you think of regime change, you picture clandestine meetings in smoky underground bunkers, massive rallies, or like UN interventions.
Right.
But Pagat says, invite your neighbors over for tea. Keep it small. He explicitly emphasizes small, intimate events where most people know most people.
And if we examine the psychology of the house party within the context of a diaspora fleeing an authoritarian regime, the brilliance of the tactic actually becomes pretty clear.
How so?
In a movement fraught with terror, surveillance, and the very real threat of transnational repression, trust is the single most valuable and scarce currency.
Because if you go to a massive rally in Los Angeles or Toronto, you have no idea who is standing next to you holding a flag.
Exactly.
It could be an informant recording phaser.
Precisely. Large crowds offer anonymity, which is helpful for avoiding immediate physical arrest, but it's terrible for building lasting organizational trust. A house party, by its very nature, is gated.
You're vetting them at the door.
You are inviting people into your sanctuary, your private space. It relies on pre-existing social bonds. You invite a trusted cousin, a lifelong friend, a colleague whose background you know.
So you are leveraging established human relationships to weave what he calls the social fabric necessary for sustained activism.
Yeah.
It fundamentally addresses psychological safety. You can't plan an interim government if you are terrified that the guy passing you a plate of food is going to report your family back in Tehran to the intelligence services.
And Pagat is absolute in his conviction regarding this tactic.
Let me quote his passionate vow here, because it really reveals how deeply he believes in this mechanism. He writes, "This is science. This is real. This is political science. There is enormous power to political organizing."
He really leans into it.
He genuinely believes that massive numbers of these living room parties will literally send political tremors through the terror regime.
He views it through the lens of scaling. One house party is just a dinner among friends. But 10,000 synchronized house parties, all subscribing to the common minimum program, all electing local representatives to feed into the umbrella organization that constitutes a political earthquake.
Right.
It is distributed, decentralized power built on unshakable local trust.
I see the architecture of it, but fear still exists, even in a living room. The regime we were discussing is incredibly brutal, and their reach is global. Informants are a reality.
They absolutely are.
So how do you organize safely when your actions in a Western democracy could put your relatives back home at lethal risk?
This is where Pagat introduces the technological core of his thesis, something he dubs democracy tech.
Because he acknowledges the legitimate, paralyzing fear that diaspora organizations have been infiltrated. He doesn't dismiss it. But he insists that this fear cannot be allowed to stop the organizing.
So he proposes a technological solution to mitigate a deeply human problem.
I have to push back hard here. When someone says an app is going to protect citizens from a sovereign state's intelligence apparatus, I get incredibly skeptical.
It sounds a bit naive at first.
It sounds like trying to stop a military tank with an iOS software update. How does a piece of democracy tech actually function to keep a network safe from infiltration.
Your skepticism is completely warranted, especially given how vulnerable commercial platforms are. But Fagat details a very specific structural safety feature for this technology.
Okay.
He isn't talking about a wide-open social media platform where anyone can create a burner account and start trolling or spying.
So what is the alternative model?
He envisions an app where the default mode only allows connections with people you have physically met in person and whom you actively choose to connect with.
So it is inextricably linked to the house parties.
Yes. The technology is merely the digitization of the trust built in the physical living room. The process is sequential. You go to the house party, you meet someone face to face, you look them in the eye, you vet them through your mutual friends. Only then do you connect on the app.
That makes a lot more sense.
The app does not generate the trust. It merely scales the trust that was established in physical reality.
It lowers the barrier to entry for communication, voting, and organizing, but it keeps the network entirely gated. You can't just search for Iranian activists and start messaging people. You have to be invited into the mesh of trust.
He does note that users can choose to bypass that default and connect with people globally, but the baseline architectural assumption of the software is localized, verified trust.
Okay, the logic holds up. It's a digital fortress built brick by brick in physical living rooms. But let's look at the people actually inside the country. Because the ultimate weapon of an authoritarian regime isn't just infiltrating diaspora networks, it's the kill switch.
The total internet blackout.
Yes, we've seen it repeatedly. When protests erupt, the regime simply turns off the internet. The country goes dark. People cannot coordinate, they cannot send videos out to the global media, and they are completely isolated.
It's devastating to a movement.
So once the diaspora is securely connected on this democracy tech, how do they overcome that ultimate hurdle? How do they reach inside a digitally besieged country?
This leads us to Bhagat's vision of decentralized mesh networks.
Explain the mechanics of this, because it sounds borderline science fiction.
Right. So a standard internet connection relies on centralized hub-and-spoke infrastructure. You have cell towers, massive fiber optic cables, and servers controlled by internet service providers.
ISPs.
Yes, and which are, in authoritarian states, controlled by the government. If the state shuts down the ISP, your smartphone is essentially a brick.
You have no signal. You're entirely cut off.
But a mesh network operates on a fundamentally different physical principle. In a mesh network, every single smartphone with the Democracy Tech app installed acts as a mini cell tower. It becomes a node.
So my phone bypasses the cell tower and talks directly to your phone.
Exactly. Using Bluetooth or localized Wi-Fi protocols, your phone connects to my phone, which connects to the neighbor's phone in the next apartment, which connects to someone driving down the street.
It's device to device to device, like a digital bucket brigade passing nodes across a classroom.
That's a perfect visualization. As long as the physical chain of devices isn't completely broken by vast distances, a message can hop from node to node.
Wow.
Bhagat envisions this bucket brigade crossing the physical geographic border into Iran, traveling rapidly through the internal population via millions of smartphones, and then hopping back out across the border to the diaspora around the world.
That's incredible.
Internet or no internet, the network survives as long as the devices are powered on and physically near each other.
It's an incredible circumvention of state power. And you can feel Bhagat's genuine awe when he writes about this capability. He literally calls it magical.
He really does.
He writes about the simple act of making a mobile phone call to someone inside Iran, and they pick up and you talk. A device not physically connected to anything, utilizing invisible waves to bridge a terrifying geopolitical divide. He says it's magic, but we've become so accustomed to it, we don't even think about it.
It reveals the deep futurist streak that runs through all his thinking.
It really does.
Yeah.
When you tie this sense of wonder back to his book titles Lumina AI, Physical AWS, The Convergence Age, you see how his belief in the transformative, almost spiritual power of technology deeply colors his political strategies.
Yeah, totally.
He doesn't just see a smartphone as a tool for checking email. He sees it as an instrument of liberation that fundamentally alters the balance of power between a citizen and an oppressive state.
In his framework, technology democratizes power by decentralizing communication. The state maintains a centralized monopoly on physical violence, but the people can build a decentralized monopoly on information.
But that raises the ultimate question. What happens when information is no longer enough? What happens when the bucket brigade of text messages and organizational votes meets actual physical violence in the streets?
Right.
Because up until this point in the blueprint, we have been talking about very peaceful, very cerebral activities. House parties, drafting human rights documents,
Yeah.
mesh networks.
The blueprint, however, does not stop at peaceful communication.
No, it doesn't. And listener, prepare yourself, because the shift in tone here is whiplash-inducing. We move from peaceful organizing to what Bhagat calls kinetic action.
He argues that the movement must eventually think beyond cyber tools and consider physical escalation.
He writes that the network needs to consider small hardware and also flying hardware. And then he drops this massive, intense paragraph. I'm going to read it directly because we have to analyze exactly what he's proposing.
Go for it.
He says, when it is time to finally come out into the streets full force, the masses are accompanied by endural drones that stay on the lookout in all directions. That information is shared with those capable of kinetic action, namely the U.S. military.
It is a profound, paradigm-shifting escalation of his thesis.
I had to halt the conversation right here and push back incredibly hard on the author's logic. We started this deep dive talking about the strict definition of peaceful organizing. He specifically anchored everything in launching peaceful umbrella organizations, drinking tea, and building trust.
Yes.
Now, suddenly we are talking about coordinating private defense contractor drones, because Anduril is a company that makes high-tech autonomous military systems, and we are talking about sharing targeting data with the United States military for kinetic action, which is military speak for lethal force, bombings, and airstrikes.
It's a huge leap.
Isn't this a massive fundamental contradiction of everything he laid out in the first half of the blueprint?
On its face, it appears to be a stark contradiction. It leaps from civilian democratic processes in a living room to coordinated international military intervention.
Yeah.
But if we try to impartially break down his logic and understand how he bridges these two extreme concepts, we find a very specific geopolitical calculus.
Walk me through that calculus, because I am struggling to bridge the gap between a house party and a U.S. military airstrike.
In Bhagat's framework, democracy tech evolves as the situation escalates. It begins as a tool for communication and building trust, the house parties, the voting, the mesh networks.
Right.
But as the movement reaches critical mass and the regime inevitably responds with state-sponsored violence, the technology dual purposes, it transforms from a communication network into tactical intelligence.
So the app that helped you securely vote for an interim prime minister is now feeding real-time positional data to an autonomous drone.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
He views peaceful organizing not as a pacifist vow to never utilize force, but as the essential political precursor that legitimizes the eventual violent overthrow of the regime.
Legitimizes it to whom? To the people in the street.
To the world, and specifically to foreign superpowers. Consider Bhagat's logic regarding international intervention. If a disorganized, fractured mob is in the streets getting shot at by regime forces, the international community might wring its hands, issue condemnations, and apply economic sanctions.
But they won't send troops.
Exactly. They will rarely intervene militarily because it is too chaotic. There is no clear partner. But if a highly organized diaspora, united under a single umbrella organization, bound by a common minimum program, possessing an elected interim government, utilizes an advanced mesh network to coordinate millions of people in the streets.
Oh, then they are no longer a mob. They become a recognized, legitimate state in waiting.
Exactly. They have proven their structural legitimacy. And in his view, that legitimate, organized entity can then call upon external superpower military capabilities like the U.S. military and private defense tech like Anduril to act as the enforcement arm of the diaspora's will.
Wow.
The peaceful organizing is what grants them the geopolitical authority to direct kinetic action.
It is treating the United States military almost like a service provider, a vendor that the organized diaspora can hire or direct once they have proven their structural legitimacy through an app. That is a breathtakingly audacious view of geopolitics.
It represents a total fusion of grassroots civilian sociology with top-tier military-industrial technology. It transcends traditional protest. It visualizes a coordinated multi-domain siege managed by citizens.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today, analyzing a deeply complex system. As we wrap up, let's just recap the sheer scale of the blueprint we've deconstructed for you.
It really spans the entire spectrum of human and technological interaction.
We started with the absolute smallest unit of human trust inviting a neighbor over for tea to circumvent transnational oppression, From there, we scaled up to the seemingly impossible task of convincing political rivals who want Sharia law and those who want a secular republic to sit at the same table and agree on a common minimum program.
We examined the rigid mathematical logic required to remove a potential monarch from executive power in order to preserve future democratic choices.
We explored the invisible physics of decentralized mesh networks passing digital whispers across closed borders during an internet blackout. And finally, we reached the dramatic climax of crowds flooding the streets, watched over by autonomous defense drones feeding tactical intelligence to foreign militaries.
And why does an intricate blueprint like this matter to you, the listener? Because regardless of whether you agree with his methods, it offers a profound, revealing look at how 21st century resistance is actually being theorized.
It outlines a whole new operating system for revolution.
It does. Revolution is no longer viewed solely through the romantic ideology of freedom. It is increasingly viewed as a complex engineering problem. It is a fusion of behavioral sociology, decentralized software architecture, and hard-nosed geopolitical alliances.
Yeah.
Bhagat's blueprint suggests that the future of overturning dictatorships might rely just as much on coding, mesh routing protocols, and organizational bylaws as it does on raw human courage.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought, something for you to mull over after this deep dive ends. We have analyzed an incredibly intricate machine designed to overthrow a tyrant. But here is the provocative question.
Okay.
If a grassroots democratic revolution relies so heavily on gated democracy tech, relies on private defense contractors like Anduril, and fundamentally requires the kinetic, lethal power of foreign militaries to ultimately succeed. Wait, let me rephrase that without the pause. If it requires all of those heavy external powers to succeed, whose revolution does it actually become once the dust settles?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right, when that interim government takes power in the newly liberated capital, who really holds the keys to the country? The people who drank tea in the living rooms, or the people who control the servers and the drones?
A vital, unresolved question about the true nature of power in a technological age.
At the beginning of this deep dive, we talked about how we want history to be like a clean X-ray. The binary snap of broken or not broken, where the tyrant is gone and the people are free. But as we've seen looking at the plumbing of this blueprint, the reality of organizing, of compromise, of technology and military force, it proves that the anatomy of a revolution is always going to be the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters.
It's never clean.
Never. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the blueprints.